The first thing I reached for was the phone. Habit, I suppose. My fingers had spent a lifetime checking clocks, checking routes, checking on Marcus in the slow hours when a thunderstorm chased the pavement's light away. That morning the screen blinked back at me with a hardness I hadn't felt since Sarah died. Marcus Reeves, blocked. My throat tightened like every postage stamp I'd ever licked all at once. I thought of reaching for the nurse call, telling someone, anyone, that there must be a mistake, that the number had to be wrong. But the call button felt foreign beneath my palm, the hospital bed unfamiliar in ways that had nothing to do with the cotton sheets and the beeping monitors. After the operation, I had expected a hand, at least one familiar footstep in the corridor. I had expected Marcus. Instead, I had a discharge paper and a polite warning about not going home alone. You don't know how brittle you are until someone tells you you can't leave the hospital by yourself. You don't know how loud a silence can be until there's no one in the chair by your bed, no newspaper spread on your chest, no muttered joke about the weather. There was just the antiseptic smell and the whisper of the air vents and the distant laughter from a family down the hall. I had spent most of my life carrying things for people. For 3 decades I carried letters and parcels down sidewalks that smelled like rain and diesel. I delivered other people's birthdays and condolences and bills, and I had always been the one to leave. Now I was the thing to be left. Patricia was kind in the practical way nurses can be, efficient, a hand on the clipboard that steadied both of us. She explained the discharge routine the way a person reads a list: time, prescriptions, follow-up appointment. There was no, "Who will take you home?" box checked on my chart. When she asked me who I would call, my throat closed. I had Mark's number memorized. I had that little curl of the corner of his voice when he was a boy. I dialed anyway, more for the motion than in hope. It rang once, twice. The thing that should have been immediate, the comfort of hearing his tone, the casual, "Hey, Pop, did they finally fix you up?" did not come. Instead, the phone gave me that cold little note I'd only seen when a telemarketer had tried to call me months ago. Message not delivered. On the screen beneath his name was a small icon, a blocked number. I lay back and watched the ceiling tiles. They had a pattern like the underside of a porch roof from some street in the old neighborhood, and the memory tricked me into thinking I could hear the clack of the mailbag against my hip. I kept thinking of the night Sarah and I had spent folding bills between us, counting pennies for Marcus's tuition, her voice low and steady, always practical even when she was tired. She had gone first. I had tried to be practical too afterward, pick up the route, keep the apartment warm, tuck receipts into the little wooden box she'd left on the dresser. Pride is a small, useful thing most of your life. It keeps you upright. But pride makes it harder to be seen when you need seeing. If you've ever been let down the way a mailbox is sometimes left empty on a stormy morning, stay with me. Drop one word in the comments. Alone or seen. I want to know I'm not the only one who knows the feeling. I did what every postal carrier knows how to do when a storm comes up. I took stock. My pension check would carry me through the month. I had no car. The little apartment smelled like the stew I hadn't yet learned to care about cooking for one. Marcus was a lawyer now. He had a house with a driveway, and once, when he was home, he turned my hands over as if he could see the grooves the mailbag had carved there, and he thanked me for everything. That memory burned as sharp as it had the first time. It is easier somehow to remember gratitude than to admit you need it now. The operation itself was a fog with bright points. I don't pretend to understand the mechanics of what those men in scrubs did. All I can tell you is how it felt to surrender. A soft tunnel, the hands of strangers that smelled of soap, and the iron tang on the oxygen. Later, waking in a room where every click meant something, I remember thinking of the mailboxes back on Riverside Avenue and how I had always found a way to get the letter through, even when the rain made the stamp slick in my fingers. That stubbornness had been habit. It had been the muscle that let me do another day. When I first learned I might need surgery, I had thought about the things people leave behind: old shirts in the closet, recipes Sarah wrote on a half-sheet, the shoeboxes of Marcus's school pictures. I did not think about being left alone in a room with fluorescent lights, with a phone that carried a furious little verdict about my son. I tried to call Marcus again. I left a message. I tried his wife's number, but I couldn't bring myself to tell a stranger that her husband had blocked his father. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes blurred, and the minutes moved like a slow postal truck crawling up the hill. The things you hide from other people reveal themselves to your own mind in that quiet. Old mistakes came forward with the clarity of stamps in a sunlit window. The nights I worked overtime, the missed recitals, the brief vacations I couldn't afford. There were memories where I'd been present, the way Marcus learned to whistle with his mouth full of marshmallows on a summer porch. The day we bought his first suit for law school, and I passed him the wallet Sarah had kept for emergencies. But mixed with those was the grunt work of a life, counting out change and holding on to stubborn frugality even as the world moved past me. I had my reasons. I clutched them like a letter pressed to my chest. I am not making excuses. I owned them then, and I own them now. Pride had been a companion and a cage. The hospital bureaucracy is both gentle and unbending. There are forms and paperclips and a social worker who has learned to nod without promising too much. Patricia pushed a card across the clipboard and said the words that make you realize you are not the center of everything. We need a discharge plan. She suggested a list: family, friends, a paid home health aide. It would be better, she said, to have someone with you when you get home. I told her Marcus would come. My voice surprised me with the firmness of it. I imagined him in his suit, stepping out of whatever car he drove now, his face that used to crumple at the sight of a scraped knee. I could see him with the same clarity with which I used to picture each mailbox down my route. I pictured him apologizing, telling me he had been busy, that he hadn't known how to show up. I held on to that picture like a talisman. When I called and saw the blocked notice the second time, my mouth went dry. I clutched the sides of the bed and felt suddenly very small. I thought of the wooden box on the dresser, Sarah's little thing with the sliding top, the way she used to nudge me to take the extra help when a neighbor needed it. I had cultivated a stubborn independence after she was gone. I told myself I wanted Marcus to stand on his own, that he needed his life, that he deserved the space to breathe. All of that is true, and all that truth is a poor defense against the cold of a phone that says you've been blocked. It is strange, the math of an argument. You subtract words, and the remainder is an absence. Marcus had his reasons, I suppose. Lawyers are always measuring the world in cause and effect, in what is defensible and what is not. Maybe there had been a conversation I couldn't remember, or a bill I had forgotten to pay, or a request I had turned down that should have been easy. I refused to turn Marcus into a monster. He was not. He was a man with appointments and deadlines and a way of stepping back that I now felt like a punishment. We had not been close in recent years. There had been silence stretching between us like the power lines over the street. But to be actively shut out, that felt like something sharper. At some point, Patricia returned with a cup of water and the kindness of someone who has stood in that corridor 1,000 times. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "we have to ensure you have safe transport. If nobody can pick you up, we can arrange an ambulance or home health. It's protocol." Home health sounded expensive. An ambulance sounded like paperwork. I tried to insist that I could get home on my own, that I had carried heavier loads than this bed. She looked at me with the same gentle firmness of someone who has seen pride cost people more than money. "People get hurt," she said. "It's not about pride." Those words ought to have landed as comfort, but they felt instead like a final tally. I had carried things for 40 years. I had never liked asking for help. Maybe Sarah had been better at it, or maybe she had taught me to be self-reliant by example. Either way, the moment had arrived where that old habit no longer served me. It was then that Dr. Morrison walked in. He did not come in like a scene from a television show, all flare and directed light. He came in quietly, the sort of man who moves through a room with the steady, careful steps of someone used to surgery and the patience it demands. He pulled his chair up without fuss, hands folded as if he was taking a moment for a cup of tea. "Thomas Reeves," he said simply. "We got you through the operation. You've done well so far. There is gratitude, and then there is something so knotty and complicated that gratitude alone cannot smooth it." I nodded. The muscle something mechanical. It was his second sentence that did something to me, though. Something that felt like a weather change you sense before the clouds roll in. "I heard you were a postal carrier," he said. "Riverside, wasn't it?" I blinked. His voice carried an accent that didn't belong to this city, a quiet manner I would later learn had come from training in places where the stakes in a room are always measured by the pulse of another person. He looked at my chart, as if reading a familiar story, then folded it and set it down with both hands. "What else did you want, Doc?" I asked, not expecting anything beyond the routine. I was tired of the unsolicited kindness of strangers acting as a reminder of what I lacked at home. He leaned back, thoughtful, and then he told me something that would take me years to unravel in my own head. He told me, in a voice that made it clear he had rehearsed this confession in the same careful way a surgeon rehearses an incision, about an envelope. "Years ago," he said, "I was a young student, struggling. There was a night I nearly dropped out. I found an envelope slipped under my door at the student clinic. Inside was $500 and a note to keep going. I never knew who left it." The moment he said it, my mind scanned through a lifetime of small acts. The ones you do in secret because shame and generosity often live in the same house. I remembered the night like a picture. The rain against the window of my little kitchen. The envelope I had taken out after counting the bills 3 times to be certain I could spare it. My bank account then had been sillier than it should have been. Bills had been tight. Marcus was still getting his footing in law school, and Sarah had suggested we send a little support, not as an expectation, but as a nudge. But the reasons for why I did what I did have always been private. I had left the envelope because I could not stand the thought of a promising person halting because of money. I recognized the handwriting on the note I had left. I had folded it carefully, the way you fold a letter you want someone to keep. His eyes met mine, and for a beat I thought of telling him to have a seat, to pour some water, to show me the spot on his chest where the scar had become a map. Instead, I asked a small voice, what only villains and saints ask themselves. Am I the one who did that thing? How small the world can feel when 2 lives line up on a memory like that. "You left it?" he asked, and there in his voice was an astonishment I did not expect. "You left the envelope?" "Yes," I said, and the word felt oddly naked. "Long time back. I thought someone needed it more than I did." He smiled in a way that made me think of an old friend remembering a prank. "It changed my whole course," he said. "I never found out who did it. I just kept going." The thought of an anonymous act rippling forward over decades was so small and so enormous at once. Here was a surgeon, someone whose hands had steadied my heart, telling me that a tiny thing I'd done had shaped another man's life. The idea that a $500 anonymous note, something I had almost tucked away in the bric-a-brac of life, could resurface like a photograph in somebody else's pocket, felt like an answer to something I hadn't known I had been asking. "If you had known," I said, "would it have felt different?" He looked at me and then around the room, at the way the afternoon light pooled on the linoleum. "Not really," he said. But it made me look for that kind of kindness afterwards. It made me try to be the sort of person who noticed when someone was alone. I felt a flush of something complicated then. Gratitude, embarrassment, the sharp shame of being found out. For all the ways I'd been proud, the secret of that envelope had been one I kept because it belonged to the quiet ledger of my conscience. It was the kind of thing people put in small boxes and never spoke of. It wasn't a story to be used. Yet here it was, unfolding like a map. A young man helped, a man of medicine shaped by a note. And now, a surgeon in my room. Why tell me now? I asked. His reply was patient. Because when I came by the clinic this morning and they told me you'd had surgery, something nudged me. I came to check on you. And then I saw your file, and I could tell you wouldn't be going home with someone you love. There is an arrogance in my voice that the world has taught me to hide. I can be stubborn in ways that are intimate and terrible, and in that moment I bristled. I'd carried an entire career not asking for favors. I had a scruffy independence that had served me when bills were due and when the weather turned mean. It made accepting kindness awkward, the way a man whose hands are used to work feels when handed a silk tie instead of a pair of gloves. I'm fine, I said automatically, the first lie of a man who had been taught to minimize. He sat forward then, hands steepled. I'm offering you my house, he said plainly. For recovery, for as long as you need, within reason. We have staff, a private nurse. You'll be comfortable and you'll be safe. No hospital food. If you need physical therapy, it's in the neighborhood. I know it's abrupt. I know it sounds impossible, I said before I could stop myself. The word sat in my mouth like a coin I had no use for. I had seen mansions on the occasional client drop-off in my career. I had never been inside one that wasn't a museum. There was a kind of shame attached to wealth if you were standing on the porch in your work-worn coat. He smiled that small, steady smile again. It's not charity, Mr. Reeves. Call it payback for a kindness I never got to repay. Call it an invitation. You can say no. There was a part of me that wanted to refuse on principle, to keep my independence like a shield. Another part, the tired part, that remembers Sarah's small, pragmatic advice and the way she used to slide a leftover sandwich into my hand when I made my rounds, wanted to accept. There was a piece of me that thought of Marcus and what it would look like if I refused this offered help. A stubborn man taking his leave in a way that looked more like pride than wisdom. I thought of the envelope again, how small it had been in my palm and yet how long its ripple had been. I thought of a young James, as I learned his first name, studying in a clinic dorm, of the way the night had been heavy enough to make a person consider giving up. I thought of the surgeon's steady hands and the way he'd looked after me on the operating table. Gratitude is not a ledger as neat as the accounts at the bank. It is a crooked road that sometimes opens into generosity from a stranger. I can't stay forever, I said, calibrating my voice to be sensible and not eager. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I can manage that. He nodded. Take the time you need. We'll have a nurse. Helen is excellent. You'll like her. Robert will drive. It's all arranged if you want it. The idea of a driver made the embarrassment come back hot. My pride hated the notion of someone else opening the car door for me. But the image of Helen, a competent, gentle presence at my elbow, soothed the rawness of being alone in the world. Too many mornings I had woken to a quiet apartment and found myself measuring the sounds of the neighborhood like a man counting his possessions. The offer of a place to rest, to be looked after, to be given the chance to heal without the constant tally of what I could or couldn't do, felt both undeserved and oddly necessary. I'll think about it, I said, because thinking was the old man's way of keeping his dignity. He didn't press. The gentleness with which he left the choice felt like another stitch in whatever strange fabric had joined our lives. There's no rush, he said, but the sooner you recuperate in a quiet place, the better for your heart. Walking down the corridor later, my feet felt like the ends of ropes frayed from too much pulling. The world outside the hospital was bright and unbothered as always. The sun on the pavement, a bus that hissed by, someone walking a dog that barked at nothing at all. I thought about Sarah and about Marcus and about that envelope folded under the lamp like a tiny promise, and I felt the first small stirrings of relief. Relief was an odd, fragile thing. It sat beside shame, but it was there. When I stepped into the driver's seat of the hospital shuttle that would take me to meet Robert, the man Dr. Morrison had arranged to drive me, the city seemed suddenly full of small kindnesses I had never noticed. The driver was careful with the doors. The seatbelt clicked with a reassuring sound. The afternoon air smelled of cut grass and something blooming in someone's garden. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the highway talk to itself. The operative word in all this was choice. James had offered me shelter. He had revealed something I'd done and what that had become. He had not demanded. He had not expected me to grovel. For a man who had spent his life measuring worth by his ability to provide, the idea of accepting help without the embarrassment of asking felt like a delicate thing that needed handling. There are times when your life pivots on a small hinge. A phone screen that says blocked, an envelope left at a young man's door, a surgeon who remembers. I do not pretend to have been wise in all the moments that followed. I was tired and healing and full of a strange mixture of gratitude and humiliation. I took the car because I had no better plan. I felt in some quiet corner of my chest the long, patient tug of consequence. What you set out into the world returns, sometimes to repay you, sometimes to test you. As the shuttle pulled away from the hospital, my window caught the line of rooftops and the first of the maples along Riverside shaking their leaves in the breeze. I had no idea then how deeply this simple sequence would bind me to a man I had never met before that morning, nor how the thawing between me and Marcus would be tested in ways I hadn't imagined. What I knew, and this was enough for the moment, was that I was moving toward a house I hadn't imagined stepping foot in, toward a kindness that had its own secrets, and toward a winter of recovery that would ask me to lay down some of the things I had been carrying too long. I thought of the wooden box with Sarah's small drawers, of the way I used to tuck receipts into it like talismans, and I understood with the strange clarity of someone learning an old lesson anew. Help has to be received as well as given, and sometimes the most generous thing you can do for your child is to show them what it looks like to receive grace. When the shuttle eased up a winding drive and we stopped in front of a house that looked like a place from a book, not ostentatious, but ordered and kind, my hands went to my knees and stayed there for a long moment. Robert opened the door with the care of a man used to carrying luggage for people whose lives had been different. He brought a blanket and a steady step. The nurse, Helen, met me in the foyer with a smile that made her eyes crinkle in the way that tells you she's already learned your face. "Welcome, Mr. Reeves," she said. "We're glad to have you." I stepped into a life that might have been a scene from another story, and I felt both out of place and oddly at rest. The surgeon's secret, the envelope I'd once tucked away like a private prayer, had come back to me in the person standing quietly in the doorway. The thing that had set all this in motion was small and simple and, in its own way, enormous. We carried my bag into a room that smelled faintly of lemons and books. A vase of flowers sat on the bedside table, and the sheets felt like an old friend's embrace. For the first time in days, I slept without listening for the phone to ring. The quiet in that house was not an absence, it was hospitality. Lying there with the sun slanting through the curtains, I felt a thin, luminous strip of the future open up ahead of me. I did not know how Marcus would respond when he learned where I was or why I had gone, nor did I know how the surgeon's secret would rearrange the columns of my life. But I felt finally that I had been given a chance to be mended not only in body, but in the rusted places that had gotten in the way of being a father and a man. The road to a reunion is not a straight line. It is a path of small, deliberate steps. Conversations that start with, "I'm sorry," visits that arrive on time, therapy that listens rather than corrects, habits of presence that replace excuses. I was not naive enough to think that 2 weeks in a house would fix years of distance. But for the first time since I woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth and a phone screen that had told me my son had shut me out, I allowed myself to imagine a future where the gestures that began with an anonymous envelope and a surgeon's recollection might lead to something like reconciliation. Outside the window, a robin hopped along the ledge and pecked at the sill, as ordinary as the mail that used to fill my bag every morning. I watched it for a while and thought of the small things that keep life moving. A note left for a stranger, a cup of tea passed across a table, a hand that steadies you when you cannot stand. When I finally closed my eyes, the name Marcus hovered in the quiet, like a letter you fold with care, before putting it back in the box. I had been blocked by my son after my surgery, yes, but I had also been found by someone whose life I had touched decades before in a gesture I gave without wanting anything in return. The fact that the surgeon's secret had resurfaced, that a small act could shape a life and then loop back to touch mine, left me speechless in more ways than one. And yet speechlessness, I discovered, can be the beginning of many sentences. Speechlessness lasted a long time, longer than the ache in my chest or the small, polite conversations I had with the nurse at the foot of my bed. It wasn't empty. It was full of names and small images. The envelope folded just so. The threadbare jacket Sarah used to patch. Marcus's laugh when he was 9 and thought he could climb the maple out front. Speechlessness gave me room to breathe and to listen. And it let something else grow. The simple work of being tended to. The first week in James's house unspooled in small domestic stitches. Helen arrived the morning after I did with a patient's soft authority. She had a way of moving through the rooms that made them feel like parts of a human body, kitchen for the heart, parlor for the lungs. She showed me how to do the simple things I had taken for granted and how to accept help for the things I couldn't do. It began with socks. The first morning I tried to wriggle my toes into a pair of thick socks, and the tug of the fabric made me wince. Helen laughed, quiet, not unkind, and sat on the edge of the bed to ease them on. That small touch felt like the end of a long list of refusals. Maria, the cook, was another quiet kindness. She put bowls of stew on the table warm as prayer, and she learned quickly what I ate and what I pushed aside. "Less pepper, more potatoes," she said once, as though she were cataloguing a piece of me the way I'd catalogued streets for 30 years. Robert drove me to my follow-up appointments with the careful courtesy of a man handling fragile cargo. He opened the car door like a gentleman and closed it like someone who knows what to protect. Days were measured by visits from a physical therapist, by the small victories of walking to the kitchen and back without sitting down midway, by the prescriptions neatly folded in the pill box Helen arranged for me. The first time I made it to the garden bench without help, I felt foolishly proud. The sun on my hands warmed the scars in a way that felt almost like forgiveness. James would come out sometimes in the afternoon, a thermos in his hand, and we would sit and speak of many things and of nothing at all. He never pressed me to analyze my life or to justify the absence of Marcus. Instead, he asked about the routes I had taken, Riverside, the corner by the laundromat, and about small mercies like the neighbor who always left a bag of tomatoes on his stoop. He knew the geography of a life by asking about its small points. He also told me pieces of his own life. Margaret's name came out in the safe, steady way he treated it, never a question, always the lightest bow of affection. She had been a quiet woman who liked birds and catalogued the china in a methodical ledger. James kept a box of her letters in the study, and once he showed me a photograph of Margaret by a lake, her hair pinned back, and a book open in her lap. I watched him watch the photo and thought about how 2 lonely acts, one an envelope, another a life set down next to a surgical lamp, had threaded us together. One afternoon, after I had managed without the cane for half the walk, He led me to his study and opened a small cedar box. "I kept something," he said. "You might not want to see it, but I did." Inside, folded with the care of someone who believes in keeping things for reasons that will matter later, was a note. Not exactly the note I had written, my handwriting had changed over the years, but a torn, faded scrap he had kept tucked like a bookmark for decades. On it he had written the date he'd found the envelope, a line about how it had come on the night he felt ready to quit, and a short, trembling, "Keep going." He turned it so the light caught the tiny corner. I felt the history of that scrap like a warm burn in my hands. "You kept this?" I asked, meaning to ask why, but knowing the answer. He nodded. It seemed small then. It seemed everything after that. That little relic sealed a strange intimacy between us. It let me see the human trace of what my anonymous act had become. A knot of hope kept in a drawer, tended to like a plant. He never claimed I had saved him with gold or with a course correction. He said instead that it had been a hand on the rail when the stairs were slick. The sort of thing that makes you keep climbing because you remember someone else did. We began taking short drives. Not because I needed anywhere, but because the world outside those hedges reminded me that life went on in small, detailed ways. James liked to drive a particular route by the river and point things out as if we were two men on a walking tour, this church, that bakery. Once we stopped at the clinic where, decades earlier, he'd slept in the cot, and he walked me through the courtyard. I could see the memory in his shoulders. For him, the courtyard was not a place of failure but a place of turning. For me, it became something else. Evidence that chances sometimes arrive in envelopes and then, if tended, grow into a habit of looking after one another. News traveled differently in a house with staff. Helen would tell me, in the most casual way, when someone had called on my behalf or when a visitor had left a message. For a while, I kept checking my phone for Marcus's name, out of habit more than hope. Each time the screen stayed mute, I walked back through the corridors of my pride and my regret, like an old man tallying stamps. Then, on about the 10th day, so many ordinary things line up on seemingly ordinary days, Marcus came. They arrived like a small storm, Vanessa driving, Marcus with his coat pulled tight and his jaw doing that thing it does when he is trying to hold himself together. When he walked into that garden, he took up the space of a man I knew and didn't know. There was that same slant to his shoulders, that same quick kind of laugh, but also a new carefulness. He saw me and his face moved like someone flipping through a book for the place they've been meaning to read and find. We talked like two people who are both trying to remember which of the old paths to take. Marcus said small things first, about the surgery, about the relief he felt when he heard I was going to be safe. He apologized in a way that was blunt rather than ornate. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry. I should have come. I wasn't trying to hurt you. A great deal of what takes the shape of estrangement is not hatred, but a calculus of fear and convenience. Marcus had his life, I had mine. When the line frayed, we let it go slack instead of tugging it back into place. He told me later that he had been ashamed of arguments that had grown into habits, ashamed about money he shouldn't have spent, ashamed that a father he had never been certain how to talk to was suddenly in need. Those things are messy. They are human. I remember how, for a long time after Sarah died, I had folded shame into the same small pockets as my socks, something practical to take out and fix and then put back. Vanessa was kind in the way of someone who has known a person long enough to know their habits. She reached out to hold my hand without fuss, and told me that Marcus had been calling but hadn't known how to say what he needed to say. I watched the way she watched him, and I saw in her a mirror for the things I had left undone. Marcus's face near the end of that first garden talk was softer than I'd seen it in a long time. There were moments when he looked at me like a man surprised to remember he had a father who could be a map and not a hazard. James, who had been a quiet presence nearby, excused himself and asked to speak with Marcus alone. I'd known from the way he'd listened to both of us that he would try to read the geometry of the situation. I could not hear their conversation, not then, but I could see the weight of it in Marcus's shoulders when he came back. 2 hours later, James called us all into his study. He had arranged the chairs so that we sat in a kind of triangle, James at the head, Marcus and Vanessa together, me across from them with Helen pouring tea as if this were some small court of soft justice. James laid out the thing he had in mind with the surgeon's crispness, a sum of money, not an indiscriminate gift, but a test and a hand, a way to get someone up when they were still on the ground. It won't solve everything, James said, and that was true. But it could give you some breathing room, Marcus, enough to get straight on your feet, pay off the worst of what is urgent. I'm offering you $50,000 with a condition. Marcus's face moved in a dozen directions at once, relief, shame, incredulity. His voice was low and fast when he answered. I'm not sure what to say, he began, then stopped. Vanessa squeezed his hand. James continued, You must show that you're willing to repair your relationship with your father. You must commit to therapy, professional help, and to a plan that shows how the funds will be used. And you must. This is for me, for you, not to be used to come back to him asking for more money. This is a one-time offer. You will show responsibility. You will show up. It was a strange calculus, and that was part of what made it work. James did not want to throw money at a problem and leave the underlying harm untouched. He wanted to test whether someone would choose to meet the deeper need when given the chance. It was not my money to decide upon. It was an offer placed in front of my son with some authority behind it. I could have refused to let him accept. I could have said Marcus could not have that sort of conditional help. But James was offering a mirror in a form of cash. That mirror, perhaps, was what Marcus needed. Marcus swallowed hard and, after a long time, spoke in a voice thin with something that had the edges of both regret and resolve. I'll take it, he said. I'll take it on those terms. I will go to therapy. I'll show you the plan. I won't ask my father for more money. I saw his shoulders drop, which might have been relief or the toll of making a promise. We sat in a way that was full of things left unsaid. For my part, I felt something old loosen. A small knot of the pride that had kept me from asking, and the stubbornness that had kept me from insisting on being seen. Perhaps the strangest thing about recovery is how much of it is borne by other people's movements. A surgeon's hand that steadies a heart. A stranger's envelope that reroutes a life. A son who steps back toward you when someone else offers him the chance to do that work. The months that followed were not cinematic, so much as steady. Marcus began therapy on the dates he promised. He showed up for family sessions, at first looking as if the idea of speaking about his feelings was an athletic stunt he had never practiced. Over time, his voice softened in a way that suggested practice. He started bringing me small things, coffee in the morning when he could, a renewed interest in my prescriptions, and which day to take them. He would come for dinner sometimes and sit at the table and ask about the mail route in the same curious way a man studies a map he once used. Once, he stayed overnight to help when I had a bad dream, and I woke to find him reading to the baby monitor as if it were a sermon. Vanessa did a kind of steadying work too. She called to check on medication refills, and she made sure Marcus was keeping the appointments he had set. At first, their visits felt like footsteps testing a porch for rot. Later, they felt like neighbors who had learned which plants needed watering. There were setbacks. There were days when Marcus would arrive late for a visit or call and speak in clipped sentences. There were times he would get a bill and worry in a way that made the old unease flare in his face. The money had helped, but money never solves the deeper things alone. The therapy and the choosing to be present, the small things like showing up for a walk, were the currency that rebuilt what had been frayed. I had my own work to do. Pride is like a rust that eats at hinges. You oil it by accepting help and by making room for the new. I found myself learning to ask for things without feeling diminished. Helen taught me how to call for help when a wound needed looking at or when a physical therapist recommended a new set of stretches. I still drove myself a little crazy, imagining I ought to be able to do everything, but I answered the call for help more often. Marcus noticed, and I think that was as important to him as anything else. James's presence remained a quiet constant. He never boasted about the envelope or made it into a spectacle. If anything, he would gently steer conversations to the practical and the human, the operations they'd done last week, the way medicine teaches humility. One evening, in late fall, we sat by the fire with a record playing softly and a pot of tea between us. He told me a story about Margaret, how she would hide short notes in his pockets before he went on long shifts, how she had taught him to read carefully, to look at the edges of things. He said that the little note he had carried for decades was Margaret's handwriting after she had believed in him enough to tuck encouragement where he could find it. The twinned images of two women, my Sarah and his Margaret, who had both, in their differing ways, tended us, moved me to the edge of tears. In the months that followed, James suggested something I hadn't quite expected. That we create a way to pay the grace forward in a manner that matched what had happened to him and to me. Not a charity that blares its name, he said, but something small that does what you did, enough to keep someone going. He was careful in his language. We can set up a small fund, discreet, slow, steady. He wanted the fund to give modest amounts to medical students and young professionals who were teetering. The quiet help of an envelope slid under a door. I laughed when he said envelope, and Helen put her hand over her mouth at the perfect smallness of the idea. It felt fitting. For someone who had spent a career delivering messages and surprises in the smallest forms, there was a poetic rightness to a fund that mirrored the anonymous note that had once kept a young man in school. We started small, with what James put into an account and what I could put in from a lifetime of small savings. We did not announce it with fanfare. We wrote guidelines in plain language: discretion, modesty, a focus on students and trainees in fields where a small gap can mean the difference between quitting and going on. We called it the Quiet Hands Fund, for lack of a better, grander name. The name fit the feel of the thing, hands that move without show, the act of giving that keeps secrets and keeps people in the work. There were days when the foundation felt like paperwork, and days when it felt like revelation. Helen and Maria handled the letters that came in from small clinics and nursing students. We set up a small committee, James, Helen, and myself, to read requests. The first envelope we sent under the fund's name went to a young woman in a residency who needed help paying for a single exam fee that would let her take the next step. Her letter, when it arrived months later, began, "I thought I would have to stop." And the rest of the line was full of the kind of surprising gratitude that makes you understand the small geometry of kindness. All the while, the relationship between Marcus and me continued to be rebuilt in the slow, ordinary idiom of presence. He came when I had a checkup. He sat in the waiting room and read the paper, and sometimes when I came out he would be there with a sandwich and a worn smile. When his daughter, my granddaughter, was born, Marcus called me from the hospital corridor in a voice that sounded like a man who had been made smaller by awe. "Dad," he said, "come in. You need to meet her." Holding that tiny, unformed person in my lap, I felt my heart both break and mend in the same instant. There are forget-me-nots, and there are moments that ask you to be small and grateful at once, and this moment demanded both. There were also other sorts of revelations. One late winter afternoon, James sat me down with an envelope that smelled faintly of his office and told me he had changed his will. I am an old man who learned early to keep receipts and promises in small boxes, and the very act of a will reading felt like standing at a shoreline where waves could carry small things away. He didn't speak as though he were dying. He spoke as though a person should set their affairs plain, like a gardener pruning a hedge. "You were part of my life in a way I want honored," he said. "I've left instructions that my estate be used in ways that continue what we started, the Quiet Hands Fund being central to it, and I want you to be the steward." My first reaction was the confusion of someone who is suddenly offered an inheritance that feels like a debt to a kindness instead of a reward. "James," I said, "you can't be serious. I can't accept that. It's too much." He laughed, but it was a soft laugh. "You don't have to manage everything," he said. "We will get lawyers to help, Helen to manage the logistics. This isn't to change your life, it's to make sure the idea lives. I want you to decide what it means to keep the chain going." He was both insistent and kind. That combination of clarity and tenderness explained a lot about him. The surgeon who could cut a heart open and still be the sort to keep a scrap of paper folded in a drawer. I accepted, not because I wanted to be wealthy. God knows a man who'd spent his years in a modest postal uniform doesn't suddenly become a nouveau riche monster, but because the idea of the fund, alive and able to help more people, made sense. The reading of the will happened with a kind of quiet formality that felt like the pages of some sober novel. There were a few people there: Helen, Robert, James's solicitor, and me. The solicitor read slowly and with that clipped cadence legal people have, and at the end my name was there in a way that felt both surreal and perfectly ordinary. There were funds to continue the Quiet Hands Fund, instructions to maintain the house as a place where people could convalesce, and, most humbling of all, a note from James that asked me to use whatever portion I wished to help Marcus in future, if ever needed. I kept my hands folded on my lap and let the room feel like a place that had absorbed a good piece of meaning. Grief arrived in small, manageable pieces. When James died, suddenly enough and softly enough that the world did not feel like an explosion, but more like a cessation of a low, steady hum, there was pain that burned like an old bandage being removed. Margaret's letters, the scrap of paper, the photographs, the quiet of Helen's tea service, they were all part of the wind that moved through the house afterward. Robert took on the role of steady man in a way that made me admire his solid, practical nature. Helen and Maria kept the house as if honoring someone by keeping their routines is the truest form of memory. The work of the Quiet Hands Fund continued. We formalized how grants were distributed, and we created a process that emphasized discretion and humility. Applicants sent notes, often just a paragraph, sometimes a sentence, and occasionally a photograph of a cramped dorm room or a tiny kitchen with potmarks around the rim. We learned how to read those things, how to see when a letter was not an ask but a cry for a chance. One spring, a young man named Aaron, no last names, we prided ourselves on retaining privacy, wrote about his third attempt at a board exam. He had been working nights, studying in the hospital basement between shifts, his lighting poor and his coffee stale. We sent him an envelope with just enough to cover the exam fee and a small note: "Keep going." Months later, he sent a photo of himself in a lab coat, clumsy and beaming at once. That photograph was the closest thing to a benediction I'd seen in some time. It felt like the loop had closed, an envelope sent, an envelope received, a life redirected. There were intimacies along the way, too. Moments that came out of ordinary days and lodged in memory like stamps in a book. Marcus and I learned how to speak without armor. We argued about trivial things, like whether the mail route used to have one extra stop. I insisted it did. And then about more tender things. His fears about money, my regrets about not saying things. He learned to accept a small set of practical lessons: how much blood pressure medication to take, how to call for help when a dizziness came, and I learned that being tended to was not humiliation, but care. Friendships grew in unexpected places. At James's memorial service, I stood among people who had been on the periphery of my life, colleagues of the surgeon, nurses who remembered his hands, a few young doctors who had been trained on his steady techniques. They spoke of him as someone who had expected moral clarity from the profession, that medicine is not just the fixing of bodies but the tending of lives. I thought about the way his life had intersected with mine, sutures and envelopes, and felt the peculiar gratitude of a man who had been found by someone he had once only touched in small, indirect ways. There was also the business of life after inheritance. Managing an estate is not as simple as a handshake. There were trustees and meetings, legal forms, and people who wore suits the way I used to wear mittens, useful but unfamiliar. We set up the Quiet Hands Fund as a modest foundation with a local board. Helen remained as the house's steward, and Robert kept up the care of the property. Marcus volunteered to help on the fund's outreach committee, partly out of a sense of responsibility, and partly because he had begun to see where his father's life and James's story met in a practical, useful way. One of the quietest rewards of all came when we held a small ceremony to mark the fund's first anniversary. We invited a few recipients, anonymized of course, and told their stories in general terms. People laughed and nodded. A nurse stood up and told us she had used a Quiet Hands grant to pay for a class that let her stay in the program. She talked about the little things that make a career possible. The broken-down heater in a dorm room at exam time, the flat tire on payday that would have set someone back for months. I listened and thought about how often the world runs on small actions that no one notices until the lights go out. If there is a rule I have come to trust, it is this: small things pile into big ones over time. A $500 envelope wrapped a surgeon's future. A quiet house held a man's recovery. A conditional offer of money made a son take responsibility instead of defaulting into habit. The economy of grace is not flashy, it is patient and repetitive. There were personal epigraphs along the way, pages I wrote to myself, if only in the way you place a stamp on a letter to cloak its contents. I wrote about what the mail had taught me, that every address is an invitation, that delivery requires not just legs, but attentiveness, that people are defined by the small care they receive rather than the grand actions they take. I wrote about fatherhood as a slow practice of showing up, sometimes imperfectly, but with enough constancy to outlast storms. I tucked those notes into the wooden box Sarah left me and felt less alone. There were days when the past crept in with a coldness. I thought of the times I had been absent, the recitals I missed, the nights I worked so that Marcus could have shoes suitable for school, and I allowed myself to be sorry. Saying sorry is not a cure, but it is a kind of clearing of the throat, a way to make room for new sentences. Marcus noticed those apologies and responded with his own versions of repair, showing up to a dentist appointment, sitting through a neighborhood lecture with me, learning how to sweep the front steps the way I'd done for years. He learned to be present in the ways that matter. We also had a small ritual that binds me to the future, like a stamp to an envelope. Once a month, Marcus and I would walk the route that had once been my livelihood, not to deliver mail, but to remember the habits that had shaped us. We walked slowly, stopping at the hardware store where the owner still knew me by sight, at the corner where the child I had once helped across the street now held his daughter's hand. On one of those walks, Marcus stooped to pick up a coin and handed it to me with a shy smile, an old habit made new. "For your pocket," he said. "So you always have something." It was a small thing, but it felt like the right kind of currency. Years slid by in ways both soft and inevitable. The Quiet Hands Fund handed out envelopes to more and more people, always in modest amounts and always with discretion. Marcus's career steadied. He learned a balance between caution and generosity. He started doing pro bono work in a small clinic where people without much money could get help. He and Vanessa grew into parenting with a grace that seemed to surprise them both. The child they named Emma, after no one famous, just a name they liked, learned to call me Pop, in a way that made me feel older and utterly present all at once. When I think back on the sequence of things, phone showing blocked, the operation, the envelope showing up as a memory in James's mouth, I am struck by how improbable everything felt and how ordinary the motion of care is. We like to think moments of grace are cinematic and rare. They are often not. They are Helen tightening the pillbox lid, Maria setting a bowl on the table, a surgeon remembering a folded scrap, a son keeping an appointment with a counselor. I learned a new vocabulary for saying thanks. Sometimes it was over the phone. "Thank you for the drive," I'd say to Robert, and he would answer in a way that made me think of a man who had found his job full of meaning. Sometimes it was in the envelope itself. I would tuck a small note into an envelope and send it to the clinic where a young resident worked. The note short, "Keep going." Once I sent an envelope anonymously to a struggling young intern who later shook my hand without knowing who I was. The feeling of being able to pay forward what had once been given to me was like a warmth in the ribs that didn't fade. There were also quiet reckonings. I had to admit that pride had robbed me of certain moments with Marcus, and I had to accept that some losses are not recoverable. We would never get back every day missed, every conversation left unsaid. But we could, with work and attention, build a life that was kinder and more deliberate than the one that had frayed. Marcus and I agreed on things like the importance of honesty, the need to check in on those we love, the value of paying attention to small bills before they become big ones. We had rituals now that felt like stitches: Sunday calls, monthly walks, a habit of sending small postcards to one another when life got loud. When I sit in the garden now, older and steadier than the man who arrived at James's door, I sometimes watch people who pass by and think of envelopes. There is an old mailbox at the end of the street with chipped paint, and a bird sometimes perches on top of it like a little judge. I think about how many lives are altered by small acts, and how often someone else's anonymous choice keeps a life moving forward. I think about Margaret and Sarah, about Helen and Maria, about Robert, about Patricia in that hospital who said, "We need a discharge plan," as if the phrase were a prayer and not just paperwork. There are a few things I did not expect. One was that accepting help would teach me how to be more generous. It is strange, but the experience of being cared for opened a door to giving that was not performative. I found myself listening more closely to the small notes people wrote to our fund. I became the kind of man who could see a life teetering, because I had once teetered myself. Another unexpected thing was the way people's lives knotted together. James had been a stranger with steady hands until he wasn't. Helen, Maria, and Robert became like family in the way they kept the house running and tended to the living with a care that didn't ask for medals. Marcus's relationship with me matured into a friendship of sorts, sometimes exasperated, sometimes tender, always present. Vanessa's steady hands helped far more than she let on, and Emma, now tall enough to bring me a cup of tea with unnecessary consideration, curls into my lap like a warm stamp. The quiet hands. Fund grew modestly, but meaningfully. We kept our awards small, the way a surgeon might make a precise stitch. We learned to trust the letters of people who did not know how to ask, and to pay attention to the small things that can tip someone over. Once, at a small gathering where recipients came to speak about what the fund meant, a young nurse told us that a single envelope had kept her in school, and that the ripple had reached 4 other people. That sentence, "the ripple had reached 4 other people," is why small things matter. One person's relief becomes someone else's safety. The chain is not an abstract metaphor. It's a practical truth. When people ask me what the secret is to being chosen by a family of people who are not bound by blood, I tell them it is simple and stubborn. Show up. Choose someone every day. Sometimes it will be a small thing like bringing a bowl of soup. Sometimes it will be the work of a foundation that writes a quiet check and slides it under a door. Sometimes it will be taking a call in the middle of the night because someone is scared. Choosing someone, again and again, makes family. There are still mornings when I wake and find a familiar ache and think of the phone that had once told me I'd been blocked. The pain now is softer. It is part memory, part warning, part gratitude. I carry it like a stamp in a book. Something to look at and learn from, not a weight to bear alone. Marcus's number is no longer a barrier but a lifeline. Sometimes he calls me just to tell me about an odd case at work, or to remind me that I promised to teach Emma how to whistle like he used to when he was small. He still makes mistakes. He is still learning, but he shows up. That is the miracle of ordinary things. Years after James had first told me his story and offered his house, we held a small supper in the dining room, where the lamp over the table threw a warm circle on the tablecloth. We invited a few people: Helen, Robert, Maria, Vanessa, Marcus, a few members of the small board that had come together to shepherd the fund. We spoke of many things, and at the end of the evening Helen cleared the plates and set down an envelope in front of me. It was small and unmarked, and I knew in an instant what it was. A note from someone we had helped, a small returning of the kindness. I opened it with the care of someone handling a letter with a fragile seal, and inside was a line that read simply, "You gave me a reason to keep going." I have kept a copy of that line tucked in Sarah's wooden box, along with receipts and the little folded notes I've written to myself. They are my ledger of the kinds of wealth I learned to value. The return of presence, the repair of a voice, the steadiness of being chosen. If I had to name the surgeon's secret in one sentence, it would be this: kindness has the power to create new loyalties. It can make strangers into family and strangers' choices into the scaffolding for other people's second chances. I had been blocked by my son after my surgery. That truth hurt in the beginning, like a raw coin in my palm, and it still stung sometimes. But the surgeon's secret, the envelope, the memory of a young man choosing to keep going, altered the geometry of my life. It taught me that what we do in quiet can echo louder than we expect. I do not now pretend that everything is perfect. There are old tensions that resurface. There are days when I miss Sarah so much it is like a physical form pressing on my chest. But there is also the steady presence of people who chose to be there. Marcus with his slow, sure apologies, Vanessa with her steady hands, Helen with her unassuming competence, Robert with his careful driving, Maria with her pots and soups. There is a foundation that writes envelopes, and a house that opens for those who need a gentle hand. There is a granddaughter who calls me Pop, with the ease of someone who knows they are loved. The last thing to say is perhaps the simplest. The world is full of opportunities to be small and generous. You don't have to make a grand gesture, fold a note, slide an envelope under the door, drive someone to the doctor, sit with them while the tea cools. If the story I've told you moves you even a little, consider doing one small kindness today, anonymously if you like. It might find its way back to you in ways you never expect. If this story spoke to you, pass it along. Share it with someone who needs to hear that small acts matter, and consider the quiet kindness you can give right now.